which is don't cancel him, the cancel culture phenomenon. You could see quite easily if this figure supports slavery or the reinvention of slavery. That is so monstrous that you would almost want to depoliticize that, or you would almost want to say it has no bearing on the contemporary situation. It's of the 19th century, leave it be. But as I just said, Nietzscheans on the right are happy to engage with his politics. That is a reason why the left must engage with his politics. Because Nietzsche has what I call a manic depressive Janus face style. He goes from talking about sublime beauty in one aphorism, and then in the next, he's talking about how the higher men need to be prepared for exerting brutality. And then so you read that and you become very confused. You know what I mean? Because like you've just taken me to the Swiss Alps in some majestic way, and now you're saying that I should be in support of imperialism or something like that. How do we balance that? My book is an invitation to read Nietzsche with some new tools, some new perspectives. It's not to say, let's take his genius down a few pegs. No, if anything, it's just meant to sort of, here is a new equipment, right?
Yeah. I am talking to Daniel Tutt. Daniel is a philosopher. He's the host of the Emancipations podcast, and he is the author of a new book titled How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. Daniel, thanks so much. I'm really excited to be talking about this book with you this morning.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I'm excited as well.
So just to sort of, for the audience to understand, this book, as I understand it, is like really at the intersection of Nietzsche and politics, which is, I think, a really fruitful and interesting, juncture. And I think your book does like one of the deepest, most helpful, illuminating readings of Nietzsche that I've come across. And people, who've seen a lot of my stuff on my channel might know that Nietzsche is someone I've wrestled with publicly, saying, struggled with and tried to make sense of. And I think your book is really helpful in that regard. And it also is equally in doing a serious political critique, or a serious look at what left-wing politics means in the modern world, and what capitalism looks like today in America, and things like that. Just to sort of put my cards on the table, I've always, again, like I said, wrestled with Nietzsche, and I felt like there's obviously something there. There's obviously something going on, but I've also associated him with a kind of like internet right-wing enlightened centrist kind of culture, like this dude bro Jordan Peterson type, that like really uses Nietzsche a lot. So sort of, how do you think about Nietzsche's place in the political landscape today and what he represents?
Yeah, it's a good question, because Nietzsche has a ambivalence regarding how he fits within the democratic, liberal, post-1848 parliamentary system. Because, when Nietzsche's a young boy, I think it was only 20% of men had the right to vote in Europe. And of course, Nietzsche was adamantly opposed to the full enfranchisement of male suffrage. He was critical of the abolition of slavery. He was critiquing Bismarck in the Second Reich later, after the Paris Commune, for being not imperialistic enough. So Nietzsche has this veiled, or kind of, you could say, esoteric right-wing position, but he's aware of the dance of politics and the kind of masks that are required in political rhetoric and in political discourse. So, for example, in Domenico Losurdo's incredible political biography of Nietzsche, which I really was inspired by in my book, called Aristocratic Rebel, which was recently released in 2020, we learn, for example, that a young Nietzsche expresses overt anti-Semitism, but confesses also at the same time privately to Wagner, Richard Wagner, who was a very famous intellectual at the time, who was more outwardly anti-Semitic. Nietzsche says you should be less outwardly anti-Semitic. So that indicates that Nietzsche has an awareness of this kind of the public sphere, right? And what Nietzsche is sort of paranoid about is the multiplicity of movements for equality from below that was opened really with the Jacobins and the French Revolution. So at the same time, we have a thinker that also is so broad insofar as he is, I mean, Nietzsche read 6 hours a day, most likely, and he comments on the entirety of the history of philosophy. He's a philologist, he's a musician, he has written extensively on art. And I think for those reasons, people have read Nietzsche in all of these different multiple ways. And at the same time, the entirety of the political spectrum gains something from him. So, for example, today, if we look at Jordan Peterson or we look at the internet celebrity Bronze Age pervert who's created a huge following for himself, or if we look at Richard Hanina, what you'll see there is a sort of really troubling, in my opinion, interest on behalf of these liberal thinkers to, one, call themselves liberal, and two, argue that modern democracy can achieve what they call neo-reactionary objectives. And that's actually a big debate for them, which is if the inequality of contemporary capitalism and democracy can kind of keep a certain status quo in place, then we should support it, right? And then whereas others will say, no, we should hearken back to overthrowing democracy and returning to a monarchy. Those are exactly the kinds of debates that Nietzsche himself was having, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is Nietzsche's true intention? Well, he's never going to tell you his direct intention, right? Although what I try to show in my book is that if you read Nietzsche's correspondence, like the correspondence I mentioned with Wagner, or you read his public lectures, or you read his letters and his notes and his unpublished fragments, you will get to the core of Nietzsche's political objectives, and they are locatable,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that would be one way to look at Nietzsche, which is he's aware of what the meaning of the public sphere is, and he's happy to conceal his agenda.
Okay, so the two questions come to mind. The first question is why not make him apolitical? You know, everyone is a product of their times. Every philosopher, especially the further back you go, is going to have
Sure.
politics that don't align with you and me, which is to say, you know, with the progressive, modern
Right.
sensibility. And number two, especially, this is also actually this is all part of question number one. But
Hmm.
furthermore, within Nietzsche himself, like, why not just separate political Nietzsche from philosophical Nietzsche? You know,
Right.
like clearly
Right.
there's something there. Like what the question is like, what happens when you subtract the politics? What is left? You know, and it seems
Hmm.
on first blush, a priori, there should be enough. You know,
Hmm.
so that I'll start with that, and then maybe I have a second question later. But what do you make of that? Why not just separate the two and just focus on philosophical Nietzsche?
Okay. Well, Nietzsche puts the virtue of honesty at the very highest virtue in his philosophy, as well as what he calls the development of aristocratic great politics. So to depoliticize that is to be dishonest. So therefore, you're not a true Nietzschean. Okay. So if you strip the politics from Nietzsche, you also, I mean, Nietzsche says of his left wing readers that he wants to engage in a fight with them and he wants for them to see. So that is an interesting reading approach that I try to say is parasitical. That's the meaning of parasite, which is don't cancel him, the whatever, the cancel culture phenomenon. You could see quite easily if this figure supports slavery or the reinvention of slavery. That is so monstrous that you would almost want to depoliticize that, or you would almost want to say it has no bearing on the contemporary situation. It's of the 19th century, leave it be. But as I just said, Nietzscheans on the right are happy to engage with his politics. That is a reason why the left must engage with his politics, to be honest and to have something to say to the right. Because keep in mind, let's say the new dissertation, which was a bestseller on Amazon in political philosophy by Bronze Age pervert. He did his dissertation at Yale on Nietzsche. He says in the very beginning that left-wing Nietzscheans are kind of a joke. Why are they a joke, according to him? Well, it's precisely because they depoliticize Nietzsche. They're not honest.
Mhm.
So you see the approach of academics to say, oh, well, the profundity of Nietzsche is so much that we gain so much in art and aesthetics and so on that we can depoliticize him. That disables us from engaging Nietzsche with the right. That would be my main argument
Mhm.
about why we shouldn't do that.
Okay. We throw around we're going to throw around the word liberal a lot, and you use the word in the book. For different people that has positive and negative connotations. Can we just define the word liberal before we go any further?
Sure. For me, a liberal is obviously liberalism has a tradition stretching back to the 16th century, which refers to, I mean, its origins is for the preservation of private property, and it has a particular commitment to advancing the sphere of individual liberty within a capitalistic society. Okay. So a liberal, for me, must be understood in the modern sweep of the post-French Revolutionary scene, in which the antagonist there emerges sort of an antagonist to liberalism, which is coming from the socialist left. So on the left, socialism and liberalism have a contestation. On the right, liberalism also has its own contestations with more aristocratic forms of governance and so on, or philosophy, political philosophy. But the broader spectrum of our system we can refer to as liberal, right? So liberalism as an ism is a political philosophical doctrine that's always in contestation. It's always like the pair of Levi jeans being pulled one side to the other, you know?
Mhm.
Liberalism has that strength to be pulled this way or the other. Nietzsche has a lot of sympathies with liberalism. Edmund Burke on the far right-hand side can say liberalism can be compatible with old feudal aristocratic agendas. On the left side, socialists will say we need to retain the demands of Robespierre from the French Revolution, who advocated for universal equality on terms of liberalism. Socialists will say something slightly different. They will say, look, liberalism has a blind spot over the market as the site for the determination of its values. And so that's my perspective. I become a critic of liberalism at that level, which is liberalism doesn't adequately address the achievement of its purported ends of universalism, because capitalism keeps a large swath of people down from realizing those true ends of liberty, equality, fraternity, etc.
Yeah.
I hope that makes a decent amount of sense for you. I know that's a lot to define, but
Yeah.
perhaps that's a good bearing point.
No, it's great, and it's helpful in understanding why the word is used, I think, differently in different contexts. I often use the word liberal, illiberal. You're just referring to being anti-democratic, but it can have different,
Sure.
connotations for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's the contemporary version, right? When we say liberal, that means something highly specific. But
right.
when I invoke it in my book, I'm referring to this broad spectrum of our political system, which itself is liberal on the right, the center, and the left. It is liberal.
Yeah. Okay. So here's sort of the question that I'm trying to formulate still, is that when Nietzsche is used, uh, let's say from the perspective for a political agenda, and you can find
Mhm.
a lot in Nietzsche which is reactionary. Let's say so it's opposed to change, opposed to suffrage, opposed to emancipation, opposed to equal rights of for women and on and on. Um, I feel like that's also a misunderstanding because that's also seems very inauthentic. When you have someone like Nietzsche who seems, at least at a first reading, to not care at all about the lower classes, to not care at all about slaves, to really put forth a project which to me at least, and you can push back or disagree, but seems really immoral, not just like capitalistic, not just like reactionary, but like really immoral. Um, doesn't that point to the fact that almost all modern political readings of Nietzsche are sort of leaving something on the table?
So Nietzsche has a particular view on the lower class, the working class, the kind of what he calls the masses, or you've probably heard this famous phrase of herd mentality. And Nietzsche develops a series of concepts such as ressentiment, which is a kind of French neologism of just political resentment, to refer to this class. But he adds a really interesting analytical critique here, which is we should not understand Nietzsche's problem or his understanding of the problem of the lower class in modern society as a hatred of them because they're stupid or something like that. Rather, Nietzsche takes on what he calls the priest, like the modern priest, and he defines the modern priest broadly, right? That can be utilitarian liberals, that can be socialists, that can be communists, that can basically be the left, broadly speaking. It can also be Christian and Jewish religious leaders. And the problem with these discourses, right, is that they preach a certain leveling out of equality. And that scared Nietzsche because, as a historian and as a philologist, he's an expert in the ancient Greek society. And he understands that the theodicy, or the justification of the subjugation of a lower class, that the Greeks discovered something ingenious about how to keep the lower class content. And he thinks that modern movements for equality disrupt that balance. So again, it's not a critique of in a vulgar way of these poor
Mhm.
people I dislike. It's not
Right.
like that.
Okay.
It's not a kind of direct racism. It's a
Hmm.
critique of the socialist and liberal intellectuals who would insist that society should be structured based on values of equality.
Okay. 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 So that I think makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably, the a good correct reading of Nietzsche. But I feel like yeah, I feel like that's not always obvious when you open them up. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. It's not always obvious, but it's hardwired into the ideas. That's my claim. And
Yeah.
that goes to the esoteric dimension of Nietzsche, and that's why we need a more full reading of him to really locate agendas, locate
Yeah.
intention.
Okay. Let's take a step back. Let's sort of make ourselves available to someone coming at this from no background. Maybe we
Sure.
could just start. How did you get into Nietzsche?
Yeah. I mean, I myself was really sort of mesmerized by Nietzsche, and it's a common trope. There's a lot of popular movies that portray the kind of adolescent Nietzsche fixation. So it's often the case, like Nietzsche is absorbed as almost like a youthful rite of passage. And I was no different than that. I read him with a certain passionate attachment. And part of that is because Nietzsche is a secular prophet. And that may sound strange to you, but let me explain why. Nietzsche calls forth for you, the reader, to break off your dependencies, whether they be familial dependencies, class dependencies, religious dependencies, etc., and to form and to become something greater. Right? This is what he calls the higher men, or the Ubermensch. Like uh, Mike Tyson, the great boxer, was when he was in prison, he did a lot of reading, and he himself was seized by Nietzsche because of this idea of the calling. He wanted to become a higher man. Okay. Now, at face value, of course, there's nothing objectionable about this process unless we understand the political architecture and design of the community that he's trying to build. So long story short, I was captivated by Nietzsche and became kind of a Nietzschean, right? Because Nietzsche doesn't write to convince people; he writes to convert people, right? And so you have to read him to understand what I mean. It's he writes in aphorisms, these short, um, poetic, uh, cryptic, beautifully written. He's one of the best prose stylists. I mean, there's been many books written about Nietzsche's style. So I was seduced. I was seduced. And then furthermore, there's been a lot written about how people from different backgrounds become seduced. Not everybody becomes seduced. Some people can detect that there's something wrong here because Nietzsche has what I call a manic depressive Janus face style. He goes from talking about sublime beauty in one aphorism, and then in the next, he's talking about how the higher men need to be prepared for exerting brutality. And then so you read that and you become very confused. You know what I mean? Because what, like, you've just taken me to the Swiss Alps in some majestic way, and now you're saying that I should be in support of imperialism or something like that. How do we balance that? And that's what keeps us reading Nietzsche. That his manic depressive almost style keeps the reader engaged. What does he really feel? So he leaves open the idea of knowing him only to those who have followed the regimentation of becoming higher men. Okay. So that's why he's so seductive. And that's why he was seductive for me.
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know about you. I mean, I don't know how you became,
Well, yeah,
I don't know if you
thanks for,
became seduced.
yeah,
Yeah, go
well,
ahead.
I'll happy to share. I mean, um, I've read Nietzsche probably in the past 4 years or so. So, I mean, I'm 36. So I went most of my life without having hardly any. I read a lot about him. He would come up a lot in my readings. Like a lot of people would deal with him or address him. And I sort of was aware of him as someone that I hadn't really read or grappled with head on. And then again, so going back about 4 years approximately, I started to, and I found him very difficult. I found him very confusing. Um, and maybe at this age, maybe I missed the window where I like really would have been seduced by the, call to community and call to self-overcoming. And so a lot of it didn't really seduce me, I think. And then I just had like this big question mark because I felt that there's something profound going on. I felt like there's something urgent, but it was also wrapped in a lot of things that I felt were quite noxious. And I also felt he was appropriated by people that were very reactionary in the sense of being opposed to political progress. And it was confusing. And so again, your book comes into the story as something that's really shed a lot of light on these questions and has really helped me out. And so there's a gratitude there.
Well, yeah, because I think it's fair to say, and there's been some things like I mentioned on this, written on this. If you are of a certain restless state of existence when you first encounter Nietzsche, it is likely that he will seize you in a way which can be quite visceral and quite powerful. Okay. And that's why he's attracted so many artists. That's why he's attracted people who are themselves on the margins of society. And that's why Nietzsche also is appealing to revolutionaries. Uh, he didn't know that. Nietzsche was retired in like his 30s, and he had a private inheritance. And so he traveled a lot. And so he led a life of pretty profound leisure. And he invested in the stock exchange to ensure that his books would be talked about for many, many years to come. He was sort of his own best publicist. And he was struck by and frustrated by at first how they didn't take off, but eventually they really, really, really took off. And so Nietzsche became, amongst the working class in Europe, the most read thinker. Next to like Wagner, I think Karl Marx was like fifth on the list. And if you read Nietzsche, you'll understand why. Because yes, it's hard, but that doesn't mean that you don't gain something. It's kind of like swimming in the deep end when you're learning how to swim. You have to do it.
Yeah.
Um, Even though you don't do it well, you don't understand everything. That doesn't really matter. You're still getting something. And the fact that you don't get it all just makes you want to read and reread it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There definitely a lot of um a tremendous value in rereading, like I
Mhm,
think the first
mhm.
time I read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I probably got almost nothing, but as you come back to it, it's always new. Yeah.
Sure,
And that sort
sure.
of maybe touches on his style as being, it feels almost like a religious text, which is interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Um,
of course, for listeners that don't know anything about Nietzsche, of course, he famously declares that God is dead.
yeah.
But in the wake of the death of God, only the higher men can possibly ascend to affirming a form of life that would be beyond the decadent mass values that the absence of God has created in the culture, right? So it's a very profound statement, which has had huge reverberations in thought and culture, the notion of death of God. But for Nietzsche and for his readers and for his community, um, there is a solution. You're right. He's not, it's not just like, in the Gospels, like the Gospels are bringing the good news. Well, Nietzsche has his own good news in some sense. Um, and that's why actually one of the great German experts on Nietzsche, Peter Sloterdijk, calls Nietzsche as opening the fifth gospel,
Hmm.
right? Which is a great irony because he's so opposed to Christianity. But he's not opposed to Jesus as a man,
Right.
by the way, and
There was
to
one true
Christ's
Christian,
teachings.
And he died on the cross.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. See, that's a quote from Nietzsche that you
Yeah.
just said, which people like, see, that's the thing is like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Hmm.
Like that's probably like put on posters today without even attributing it to Nietzsche, right? That's what I mean by like Walter Isaacson wrote the biography of Steve Jobs, and he's like, what did Steve Jobs read? Well, Steve Jobs didn't read Nietzsche, but Walter Isaacson said he didn't have to
Hmm.
because Steve Jobs already saw himself as a higher man.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is what I call Nietzscheanism, okay? A
Hmm.
cultural absorption of his ideas. I mean, every writer, every philosopher would want that to happen from their work. But of course, Nietzsche also says crazy things like, I will be responsible for catastrophes the world could never imagine. He says
Hmm.
that in his later years. My thought will be responsible for catastrophes. And of course, Nietzsche actually does predict great, what he calls great socialistic wars in the future.
Hmm.
And then he says, after these great socialistic wars, my philosophy will truly begin.
Yeah.
So, yes, people have said Nietzsche has a I mean, the Muhammad Iqbal, the Muslim philosopher, thought that Nietzsche tapped into prophetic uh, communication. And then he adds that it's unfortunate that Iqbal himself could never meet Nietzsche because he thought if he were to meet him, he could convert him to Islam.
Hmm.
But the
Seems
point is, he
unlikely.
thought that he unlikely. Well, actually, Nietzsche actually had very positive things to say about Islam.
Right.
Um, there's actually several books on that,
Interesting.
on Nietzsche's comments on Islam. So
He
you
seems
may,
to have
it's
had a,
possible.
yeah, he seems to have had a God complex, to some extent, which maybe it's a psychological term that's thrown around quite loosely. But yeah, he seems to, obviously it's well known that he spent the latter part of his life in sort of a deep state of intellectual mental derangement. And so
True.
there's something extreme about his, yeah, about his sense of self, you might say, whatever that means.
Yeah, he spent the last 10 years of his life in kind of a catatonic state, but his sister became his publicist, Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, and she was a sort of vulgar white supremacist. And Hitler famously gave Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche a state funeral when the
Hmm.
Nazis came to power, and she died. And there's a whole history of how the Nazis appropriated Nietzsche through Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, and that becomes a site of a profound debate. And there's, massive things written. Richard Holub is the foremost expert on Nietzsche and the Jews. I recommend any listener to read Holub's work. It's a huge debate and conversation because they took over the Nietzsche archives, and then when the Soviets overcame the Germans in the Second World War, East Germany became kind of in charge of the Nietzsche archives. And there's this great American scholar of Nietzsche who said the Soviets would interview you for several hours if you're a scholar of Nietzsche and you wanted access to the archives,
Mm.
because they wanted to find out if were fascist or not.
Hmm.
And if you indicated a right wing affinity to Nietzsche, they would deny your access. It's an
Yeah.
interesting point.
When I read Nietzsche and he talks about himself and he talks about his audience and who he's reaching, he says things which sound very hyperbolic, but the most maybe extreme example is his autobiography Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, which is written in the later years of his life, and
Mm,
it's
mm,
so self-aggrandizing. It's like shocking. Like the chapter headers are like why I write such great books, like why I am so amazing. Um, and one of the things that struck me when reading that is like he goes on at length at how like he cannot fathom what it means to have a prick of conscience. Like he cannot fathom. It seems like he's trying to say that he's like a fundamentally different psychological or spiritual attitude in life than most people can comprehend. Like most people, I think, know what a prick of conscience means. I think most people have, whether or not they believe in God. Many people don't believe in God, of course, but I think many people can imagine what it
mm,
means to have like a question of God, like
mm.
even is it something where, but Nietzsche writes like he can't even fathom the question, you know what I'm saying? And I think
Mm.
as a reader, it raises like this question of like, what do we do with that? Like, is he being hyperbolic? Is he being insane? Or does he have like a fundamentally sort of different state of being that is like actually very
Mhm.
hard for us to fathom?
Yeah, I have a section in my book called The Limits of Psychobiography. And there's a famous French philosopher named Jacques Derrida who wrote a book about Ecce Homo. And I analyze it in my text, you know. And in that book, Derrida says, look, we can provide a kind of psychoanalytic reading of Nietzsche and Ecce Homo, right? Because you know, he's the wanderer, like because he has this notion of the wanderer and his shadow. And that's actually a reference to Nietzsche's mother and father, right? Which is um, Nietzsche's father was kind of a shadow of a man. He never became his full self. He never realized himself. He never became as full potential. Um, and then he says that Nietzsche then wandered over the womb of the earth, referring to the mother. And so there's this whole kind of psychoanalytic, almost like Freudian Oedipus way to read Ecce Homo, which I find Derrida says something quite interesting about that because if we take this notion that I said a moment ago that Nietzsche opens the fifth gospel, right? The meaning of the fifth gospel is the revelation, right? The prophetic revelation that our culture is plagued by narcissism. Okay. It's no surprise that Nietzsche went on to influence so much of psychoanalysis, right? Freud and Jung were building off of a lot of Nietzschean thought and legacy. But this idea of narcissism in Nietzsche is interesting because he's saying to the reader, on the one hand, um, I am dynamite. I am all the names of history, right? My books will be read for 2,000 years, these bombastic statements. But part of that is the meaning of the death of God, because if the death of God is true, that's a revelation that each of the tribes, ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups are fundamentally at their core narcissistic, caught in a narcissistic predicament, just like Nietzsche is. Okay. So that's a sort of that can be read in multiple ways, right? Um, Now, I think another way to read that, however, through my prism, through this more, let's say, more political prism, okay, would be that as a community building philosophy of the Ubermensch, of the higher men, Nietzsche's calling alternative community to the egalitarian communities that he saw all around him. And in that way, he has to be bombastic. Zarathustra has to, uh, in order for Nietzsche's philosophy to succeed, he has to seduce us like that, right? So he's playing with the kind of inbuilt narcissism of the human being.
Hmm.
It's a sort of game. That's and so Ecce Homo is one of Nietzsche's most important texts, I think, for this reason. You know, bringing out these problems of narcissism and fame, right? And obsession with one's own fame, and all of the different ways to read that. I mean, there's a lot of Nietzscheans online because you see that gets funneled into an entrepreneurial notion, and you
Hmm.
can see a lot of think about the right wing entrepreneur um, who is unabashedly narcissistic, right? Unabashedly for their own self promotion. Again, Nietzsche's argument is the individual must break off from all dependencies. They must break off from the herd. So how does Nietzscheanism fit into the entrepreneurial mythology? And you can see exactly, I think, how it fits,
Yeah.
right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. It does. It does. Yeah. Um, I think an alternative reading is that Nietzsche again. I keep coming back to this, and you might hear me repeat this again and again. But the sense that
Sure.
Nietzsche is like a different kind of person, that the sense a possibility. Of course, he's appropriated by the capitalist entrepreneur who is self-promoting himself and has very inflated narcissistic view of his own self-worth. But this alternative reading, which is alluring to me, is that there's actually something fundamentally different about Nietzsche that like which is hard for us to comprehend. you know that is not
Maybe.
quite narcissism. It's something else.
Well, Carl Jung gave a series of seminars on Nietzsche um, as the Nazis were coming to power. And at that time, these potent ideas of Nietzsche's community building philosophy. I mean, listeners should know that there was a famous case in America of a Nietzschean murder of
Yeah.
two young boys at the University of Chicago read Nietzsche at 16, 17, and went out and tried to kill a lower class person. And then Clarence Darrow defended them. But the basis by which Darrow defended them in court, you know what he said was, Your Honor, you should exonerate these boys because they read this powerful philosophy at too young of an age.
Yeah.
And Jung said the same thing, which is Nietzsche needs to come with a warning label on it. Okay. So all of those those are all real. One of the interesting things, though, however, and I should talk about this in the book, is that after the Second World War, a lot of academic Nietzscheans have wanted to say, look, we can de-emphasize the intense right-wing agenda of Nietzsche and this intense aristocratic agenda. And they do that, and I show different strategies by how they do that. Walter Kaufmann is the best example. They remove certain words like the annihilation of the failed or the destruction of the weak or things like that. And so what you get is a kind of domesticated Nietzsche, right? A pop Nietzsche, right? Where if those things are de-emphasized, it will be safer for the 16-year-old boy to read Nietzsche and not go off and do something crazy, right? But the other thing there is that a lot of folks have tried to say, look, Nietzsche's just a madman. And so you can't really you have to assess everything from that standpoint. And that becomes the basis of his indeterminacy. But I mean, let me tell you, my view on that is that if that's really true, my question always to those liberal academics that say that is kind of like, well, then why are you reading him? Why do you revere him so much if it's all madness? I don't really trust that argument. I don't think it's good enough. Like, yeah, there's some madness, but there's also a lot of consistency that you're not recognizing. And anytime something that Nietzsche says you don't like, you can attribute it to his madness. So it becomes an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? I'm not as comfortable with using the madness card.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because Nietzsche has this political agenda that can be revealed. And so it's more productive to funnel things back through that. Keep the madness in mind, but if you want to look for consistency in Nietzsche, there's a way to do that. And that's what my book is trying to point to.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioned this this way the court case where the kids were corrupted by Nietzsche. I would suggest, I think this might be outside the scope of our conversation to some extent, but I would suggest that Dostoevsky explores that as well, that Crime and Punishment, although Nietzsche, of course, is not, I don't think Dostoevsky knew Nietzsche, but the ideas described there, and also Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov, are very Nietzschean. And I think the central struggle of that book is what happens when these ideas take hold in someone and it causes them to do
Yes.
something outlandish. Maybe mindful of our time here, which is running.
Sure.
If we could try to speed run some Nietzschean concepts together.
Let's do it.
And so we talked already about God is dead. How about amor fati?
Yeah, I mean, part of this is Nietzsche's, I mentioned before, his cosmodicy, right? Which is Nietzsche wanted to reinvent after the death of God how man relates to his or her own fate. And Nietzsche therefore puts the sort of virtue of love of one's fate at the very center of any philosophical endeavor, right? I have an interpretation of that. We don't need to get into you can read the book to find out, but this is a very, very important Nietzschean idea. But it's about love of one's fate. It's also deeply tied to the notion of the eternal return of the same.
Yep. Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit. So first of all, I mean, Nietzsche suffered a lot tremendously in his life. I think your reading that you're gesturing at is a political reading, I think, right? You can tell me if I'm wrong or if I'm misunderstanding, but like a sort of a reactionary role that can play in terms of upholding an economic and political hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yes.
And right. Personally, Nietzsche himself, he suffered tremendously. This is well known from his biographers and his own autobiography and whatever. And was sickly and bedridden, and he writes so beautifully and powerfully. I mean, I'm gonna just paraphrase it off the top of my head and I'll butcher it, but like, imagine a demon came to you in like your darkest hour and told you that everything you've done, every moment of your life, you're going to have to relive over again, like, and imagine what that would like feel like,
Hmm.
so okay, so this concept of love of fate, this concept of embracing everything of your life, and this concept of the eternal recurrence. So one question that comes up is was that meant to be literal? I mean, I suspect you're going to say it wasn't. Um, but what do you think about that?
Yes. It's meant to be a thought experiment for his community, for his readers, to attempt to master. Okay, the eternal return of the same is a device that's meant for the kind of spiritual acrobatics of a community to come in the wake of the death of God, and a challenge. It's a challenge at the same time, right? To live in such a way where one can be as content as possible with the world as it is and with the events of one's life. Okay. So that's the kind of higher point. He also has a cosmological claim there tied into what I try to show, where the concept really emerges from, is from Nietzsche's reading of the philosopher of the socialists, uh, Blanqui, in the Paris Commune, who had an idea of the eternal return, which was based on the notion that um, collective human becoming can change the conditions of the world. Part of what makes the eternal return reactionary in my reading is the affirmation that human becoming cannot change the material conditions of the world, and that is why Nietzsche intervenes into the category of conversion, in the religious Abrahamic category of conversion. Because if one affirms the eternal return, you are affirming the kind of eternity of the material relations of the society. So it's a different type of conversion. It's not a radical homage to a conversion. And so, again, that eternal return I talk about in the book as a sort of political concept, but it is also cosmological. Nietzsche wanted to apply it to science. He never got the chance to really flesh that up, but he wanted to. And it is also a community building device for the higher men to wrestle with, to try to come to master. And Nietzsche says only few will master it. Only a few.
And that seems reasonable. I mean, it seems like a hard thing to master. Um, but but again, so this paradox of Nietzsche and his madness. But I think giving thought experiments and giving perspectives that are challenging, possibly out of reach for many of us, but in some way, I think mind expanding. Um,
Of course.
Yeah,
Of course. Of course. No, again, this is the my book is an invitation to read Nietzsche with some new tools, some new perspectives. It's not to say, let's take his genius down a few pegs. No, if anything, it's just meant to sort of, here is a new equipment, right?
yeah.
um, a new suit to wear to protect yourself from any possible, if you are on the left, right? If you're concerned with, like, advancing equality, progress, and so on. It's just important simply to understand the insane political agenda of this thinker and the time in which he lived and generated his ideas.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
you
of
know what
course,
I'm saying?
yeah, 100%. And equally the way he's used today, equally.
Absolutely.
All these ideas are used today for political means. So 100%.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
how about decadence? Right.
Okay. Decadence. Well, decadence is a culture-wide effect that is born from nihilism, and therefore decadence is a type of cultural infestation of the movements of equality from below, as well as in philosophy and in thought, the effects of philosophers who would argue that the universal and the absolute is accessible to all. That disturbs a certain social balance. So decadence, it comes about when the possibility of great art, thought, philosophy, and so on is disturbed. And Socrates, for example, because of the universalist basis of his doctrines, is a thinker of decadence. Nietzsche will go on further and say physiologically, there's also a physiological and health basis to decadence, which is that those philosophers that preach equality are also sick. They're also sick philosophers. Okay. And so Nietzsche has a lot to write about overcoming sickness, right? And that actually then ties us back to his own madness, because he himself wrote for what he calls convalescence, right? For people that are in the process of overcoming the illness of egalitarianism. That's the higher man. That's the higher calling, you see. So it's an invitation to affirm a form of life. It's right that is beyond the sickness of egalitarianism.
Hmm.
That's decadence. Decadence is also a crisis within the ruling class. It also occurs when the ruling class fumbles and is not consistent about its project. Because one of the things that Nietzsche is most concerned with is how culture can retain artistic greatness, right? And his critique is that from below, these movements of equality are going to shatter that whole edifice of creative output. So this is how I would understand decadence.
It's very easy to see how and why that's been used for political means.
Oh yeah.
No question about it. Is there a grain of truth to this though? Is there something we can point to in our modern world? Are we at all decadent today?
I mean, look, there are there are movements for equality that need to be um, assessed head on. And I mean, I'm thinking here of um, a lot of the fallout from the George Floyd uprising and the attempt by corporate America to promote equality vis-a-vis Black Americans and the long-standing reckoning on racism in our history. Now, there's many ways to read that. I think a right-wing Nietzschean way to read that would be it would be simple answer, right? Which is um, the collapse in our culture has all of these different symptoms and effects, but it comes from an attempt to raise certain people higher than they should be because they don't belong to be raised higher. Because you see, Nietzsche says, my philosophy is for the application of a ranking in society. It's not an individual morality. He actually says that. So for Nietzsche and the Nietzschean philosopher, it always goes back to decadence and nihilism is always related to this improper ranking system. Now, I think as a person on the left, I have to disagree with that. I have to disagree with that on principle because my values insist that I disagree with that. Is there a grain of truth to that? Well, no, because if we say there's a grain of truth to that, I think that we are compromising our own commitments to reason and to universalism and to the values of full equality. So I can't accept that.
Yeah. I
I
guess
can't accept it. Yeah.
I
I
guess
don't
the
know about you.
question, yeah, I guess the question might have been like, is there a reading of decadence that can sort of neuter it of its like hierarchy ranking connotations, you know? But maybe not. Maybe that's too far of a stretch of Nietzschean's of language there.
No, it's still valuable because he's still locating a problem that
Hmm.
accounts for a kind of class disarray and chaos that's happening in society. It's the prescription
Hmm.
of the commentary apropos ranking and reinforcing inequality that is the problem. This is a constant theme with Nietzsche. It's the same with ressentiment, with resentment.
Sure.
Is resentment real? Of course. Is Nietzsche's prescriptions for it correct? I don't think so. It's
Right.
the same here with decadence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. When I think about resentment, like as you said, and in your book you talk about sort of the way in which it's just used to dismiss political movements and people and communities. But yeah, and again, trying to find a grain of truth in Nietzsche. I feel like his perspective identifies, which many on the right and enlightened centrist, reactionary, liberal people kind of identify, is that like in some sense there's political questions, there's like the human questions, and you may or may not fight for political equality, but at the end of the day, like there's like a deep like emptiness, I think, or a deep hole that ultimately doesn't get filled by just where you are in the hierarchy of society. There's this maybe this desire for more money, let's say, just to make in the most crass simplistic terms. People want more money, and Nietzsche comes and says, it's not going to make you full. It's not going to make you happy. You're of resentment. You're jealous. You want something that is in and of itself is not it's too superficial or something like that. And again, that's not a complete that's not doing justice to Nietzsche's political project, which is what your book does. It does justice to his political project. But I
Yeah.
think of that maybe as like sort of again a distortion, misinterpretation that touches upon maybe a grain of truth or something.
I think that's true, but I think that often with Nietzsche, because he is so famous and because you see Nietzsche put such a big onus on the category of genius. One of the things that I think is troubling is that people will latch on to Nietzsche, and this is part of the reason why people are so passionate and why they defend him so much. This is why my book is kind of like disturbing the hornet's nest. Um, because if you identify with the calling of Nietzsche, you're trying to yourself become known and recognized as a genius in some way. And that's what Nietzsche wanted, which is that he thought that movements of equality will abolish the possibility of genius, right? And Nietzsche, in a sense, referred to the Übermensch as the oligarchs of the spirit, right? So he tries to naturalize a conception of the world in which only rare geniuses push culture forward, okay? And I think that, therefore, oh, by the way, therefore he's fine with mediocrity. That's an important caveat. You have to ask yourself on the left, are you fine with mediocrity? Or actually, do you want the masses to increase? Like, if the Nietzschean vision is only that an elect few are true geniuses, then what happens then is that they have to enforce mediocrity, and they have to basically make a false claim that, yeah, let's make sure they're content in being mediocre. That's what they want. So they can kind of do, but that's actually harmful to the project that Nietzsche wants, which is great art making. What I would like to see is the possibility of a fuller blossoming of greatness, not the suppression of it, right? So that actually is real. Like Nietzscheanism is I think that's undisputed, is this elite idea of genius. And I think that capitalism, like Occupy Wall Street said, the 1% versus the 99%. Capitalism has kind of regressed to this situation, even in art, and that's a problem.
Mhm.
That is a major problem.
Yeah. So I mean, there's so many Nietzschean concepts which, if we had tons of time, I would love to touch on. We haven't talked about Nietzschean morality. Perspectivism is a term that comes up in your book, which is fascinating and love to discuss with you. But maybe just in the interest of time, Bonapartism, also one of these concepts that come up in your book that, like so many, has like a very strong resonance to what's going on today in America. So what is Bonapartism, and how does that relate to Nietzsche?
All right. So Bonapartism obviously refers to Napoleon, the great Napoleon, who is kind of the restorationist figure in the sequence of the French Revolution, who restores order and then engages in an imperial conquest of Europe, stretching all the way through to Egypt to Russia, and everyone is very familiar with that story. However, uh, about 40 plus years after Napoleon dies, one of his cousins reemerges as a political figure in France. And this is a figure who emerges on the political scene when the political scene was kind of undergoing decadence. It's another way to understand decadence. The ruling class, the liberal bourgeoisie, um, could not sort of justify the existence of rampant exploitation, hunger, terrible wages for workers, and kind of squalor for the working class. And so they have this figure emerge within the parliamentary system, um, Louis Bonaparte, and he has this kind of incoherent political agenda where he's sort of siding with the aristocracy, but he also attracts workers that are disbarred from work, the lumpen proletariat. And so he puts together this kind of crazy coalition, and he wins democratically. He wins, and what that allows is for liberal the liberal capitalist order in France to continue without revolutionizing the problems that are deeper in the society, without revolutionizing the wage, and the problem of the worker and so on. And so Karl Marx has this essay that he writes about this moment in Europe, and he gives it a name called Bonapartism. And Bonapartism is a theory in Marxist theory, which talks about how capitalism restores itself. So over like when the decadent crisis of the capitalist system, the ruling classes, the two ruling class parties, um, face a crisis of the system, they call forth, they summon forth a Bonapartist solution. And a Bonapartist solution comes from outside of the two-party system. So here's an example. FDR. FDR is from an aristocratic family in America, but he makes a partnership with the socialist cause to save American capitalism and usher in the New Deal. We're all familiar with that. In Marxist theory, FDR performs a Bonapartist function by doing that. That is what we call soft Bonapartism, right? Because it's kind of trying to take the system and restore it in a way which gives more equality overall, but importantly, doesn't revolutionize it. Donald Trump can be seen on the opposite end of that spectrum as a figure that emerges from outside of the two dominant parties, but tries to restore things through a more authoritarian form of order. But like Louis Bonaparte, Trump created a coalition which was basically incoherent, right? He's against the globalists, right? The so-called global financial capitalists, even though he himself is one, right? And he is attractive to disenfranchised former industrial workers across the US, right? So you see the similarity there in the coalition, right? And he's outside of the two-party system. So this is what Bonapartism is. And what I think is interesting about it is that it keeps an unjust social order intact by applying a band-aid. And their paradox is that the ruling class ultimately, even though they hate it, they have to support the Bonapartist because they don't change the material conditions. Okay. Now, you can have a hard Bonapartist like Trump become a fascist, right? And that is when they fully break from the democratic procedures. And that's a big debate we can have, whether Trump has elements of where is Trump from hard Bonapartism to fascism? That's an interesting debate. But you see, what the value of the concept is for us is that it gives us a way to think about capitalist crisis and how the two-party system responds to it. Now, Nietzsche was a huge admirer of both the first Napoleon and this later Napoleon. Why? Because again, what Nietzsche wanted, and this is one of my central claims, is the preservation of kind of existing material systems of exploitation. He didn't want a big disturbance. He didn't want the left wing to truly win. He didn't want revolution. He's an anti-revolutionary thinker. If you're an anti-revolutionary thinker, Bonapartism becomes an ingenious way to keep the status quo in place, right? Because it doesn't challenge the true distribution of property. Nietzsche has a huge critique of socialized property. He's very opposed to it. Bonapartists will keep property relations intact, but they will satiate the discontents, the resentments of the workers. That's why Nietzsche is Bonapartist. A hard Bonapartist. He wouldn't be like in favor of a left-wing Bonapartist. And Bismarck, of course, is a Bonapartist as well, by the way. Bismarck is doing the same thing. And Bismarck even created these things called the anti-socialist laws to stamp down the left-wing threat. And Nietzsche was in favor of those.
How has it been kicking the hornet's nest? How has it been bringing the news that Nietzsche is not your political ally to the left?
Well, it's been I've had a lot of solidarity. I've also had a lot of passionate rebukes. I mean, we'll see. I've had a few reviews that have been positive so far. We'll see where that goes. That requires a bit of context because after the Second World War, Nietzscheanism kind of triumphed. Like Alan Bloom, who I don't agree with politically, he wrote The Closing of the American Mind. He was a philosophy professor at University of Chicago, trained by Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss is a huge admirer of Nietzsche. So he trained a whole generation of American philosophers in Nietzschean philosophy. But Alan Bloom recognized that after the Second World War, the left has kind of abandoned its egalitarian universalist platform and has actually adopted Nietzsche. So what the story merits, I don't have the time to go fully into it, but I get into it in the book, as you remember, is that the left has kind of adopted a kind of anti-egalitarian platform. Not always, but in some cases they definitely have. And a lot of that is owed to the French Nietzscheans. Michel Foucault is a major, major figure in contemporary humanities studies. I mean, at UC Berkeley in America, Foucault reigns supreme. Foucault also said he is thoroughly Nietzschean, right?
Mm.
So this sort of left-wing Nietzschean impulse troubles me. It troubles me. Like, for example, in Foucault's famous debate with Chomsky, Foucault will say, look, the working class, the proletariat, Marxist proletariat, doesn't need any reason to revolt. They revolt if it is their will to power to revolt, right? So this is why the right wing will say Foucault is a relativist, right? Which is great irony, because the right wing reads Nietzsche differently than Foucault reads Nietzsche. But you see, they're in this kind of vicious Nietzschean circle. And so another thing that left-wing Nietzscheans will do is they will say, look, we don't need to promote programs of equality, right? Because they've internalized Nietzsche's teachings on this. And therefore, we don't need to think about a future society beyond capitalism that would be interested in the rights of man or rights in general. So you get this kind of very ludic and militant Nietzschean leftism. And I have some criticisms of it. And so those are really passionate debates. And part of it is hard. I mean, like I said before, if one of his highest virtues is honesty, my response to the left Nietzscheans is always like, what? Like, because there's books written where people say Nietzsche is not a reactionary, right? It's those kinds of critiques that I'm really concerned with, and I think that are not honest. You know, I would rather that we read him in a more true way, because that's what he wanted his left-wing readers to do. I think that Nietzsche would be more happy if the left was reading him with an understanding of his reactionary agendas. And that's okay to read Nietzsche as an enemy. Nietzsche actually invites us to read him as an enemy.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's hard for people. It's hard for people to have nuance. It's hard for people to not, either fully embrace or fully reject. But I think your book is,
Yeah.
an excellent example of what is possible and should be aspired to for sure.
Thank you.
Wonderful. That's it. Daniel, thank you so much. This has been tremendous fun, and it's been really enlightening for me to sort of help me rethink and revisit my Nietzsche. So thank you so much.
I hope everybody gets the book and that they enjoy it. And thank you, Ami, for a great conversation. I thought it was spirited and enjoyable.